The air in these forgotten hollows of Appalachia holds its breath. Even in 1924, 3 decades after the silence fell, the woods remember. They remember the screams. A lone trapper named Alastair Finch, his face a roadmap of hard winters, was the first outsider to set foot in Blackwood Creek since the end. He was tracking a phantom buck, one with a rack of antlers wider than a cabin door, a creature of local legend. The trail led him deeper into the oppressive quiet of the mountains than he'd ever dared venture, into a valley the maps had conveniently forgotten. The trees here grew too close, their branches interlocking like the gnarled fingers of praying skeletons, blocking out the sun. The silence was the first thing that felt wrong, not the peaceful quiet of the deep woods, but a heavy, listening silence, a silence born of tragedy. He crested a ridge and saw it below, a small settlement of cabins, smokehouses, and a stark white church, all perfectly preserved yet utterly dead. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No dogs barked at his approach. The only sound was the frantic pounding of his own heart, a drumbeat against the suffocating stillness. He descended cautiously, his rifle held tight, the feeling of being watched prickling the back of his neck. This place was not empty, it was haunted. Haunted by a story that had been deliberately buried, a tale so disturbing that the world had conspired to forget it ever happened. Alastair pushed open the door to the nearest cabin. The hinges shrieked in protest, the only voice the valley had heard in 30 years. The interior was cloaked in shadow and thick with the dust of ages. A fine layer of gray powder covered everything, a table set for a meal that was never eaten, a rocking chair frozen mid-rock, a child's rag doll lying discarded on the floorboards. But it was the family at the table that made Alastair's blood run cold. They were still there. 3 figures, a man, a woman, and a young boy, sat slumped in their chairs, their bodies desiccated by the dry mountain air, turning them into leathery mummies. Their faces were the most horrifying part. Their eyes were wide, hollow sockets staring at something unseen on the far wall. Their mouths were agape, locked in a permanent, silent scream. Their hands were curled into rigid claws, the fingernails broken and bloody, as if they had tried to tear their own way out of an invisible trap. It wasn't disease that had claimed them, not in any way he understood. This was the work of pure, unadulterated terror. He backed away slowly, the scene forever burned into his memory. In every cabin he checked, he found the same macabre tableau. Entire families, frozen at the exact moment their souls were ripped from their bodies. Blackwood Creek was a tomb, a monument to a horrifying event that had claimed every last soul. An event that began and ended with the arrival of a woman known only as the widow. To understand the curse that fell upon Blackwood Creek, we must rewind the clock to the spring of 1894. The settlement was a tiny, self-sufficient island in a sea of unforgiving wilderness. The families who lived there, the Canes, the Millers, the Wards, were bound by blood, faith, and a shared distrust of the outside world. Their lives were governed by 2 things: the harsh cycles of the seasons and the fire and brimstone sermons of preacher Thuron Cole. The preacher was a man carved from the mountain itself, tall, gaunt, with eyes that burned with righteous fury. He saw the devil's work in every shadow, in every crop failure, in every whisper of dissent. He preached that their isolation was a blessing, a shield against the sins and corruption of the cities. But their isolation was also a cage. It bred suspicion. It nurtured old grudges and allowed superstition to grow like poisonous ivy, choking the roots of reason. The people of Blackwood Creek believed in signs and omens, in haints that stalked the moonless nights, and in curses carried on the wind. They were a proud, hard-working people, but their faith was brittle, and beneath it lay a deep, primal fear of the unknown, a fear that was about to be given a name and a face, a fear that would soon demand a sacrifice. The stage was set for a tragedy of horrifying proportions, waiting only for its catalyst. Her name was Elara Hemlock, and she arrived in Blackwood Creek not as a harbinger of doom, but as the wife of Silas Hemlock, a quiet man who had left the valley years before and returned with a bride the likes of which no one had ever seen. Elara was an outsider in every sense of the word. While the other women were plain and weathered, Alara possessed a stark, dark beauty that was both captivating and unsettling. She spoke with a strange accent from some far-off place, and her knowledge of the forest was unnatural. She knew the secret names of plants, which roots could soothe a fever, which leaves could numb pain, and which mushrooms, she warned, could bring visions of hell. T. He women of the creek whispered that she was a root worker, a practitioner of forbidden folk magic. The men watched her with a mixture of desire and fear. Preacher Thuron declared her presence a test of their faith. She and Silas lived apart from the main cluster of cabins, in a small, isolated homestead near the ancient spring that fed the valley's main well. Alara, for her part, seemed content in her solitude. She kept to herself, tending her garden of strange herbs and exploring the deep woods, her constant companion a tattered book filled with diagrams and writing none of the townsfolk could decipher. They did not see a healer or a scholar. They saw a witch hiding in plain sight. Her very existence was a disruption to their rigid world, a dark seed of doubt planted in the heart of their community. The beginning of the end came without warning. It was a humid afternoon in late summer when Silas Hemlock, a man known for his robust health, stumbled out of the woods, his face pale and slick with sweat. He collapsed in the dirt before he could reach his cabin, his body racked with violent convulsions. The men who carried him inside described a horrifying scene. His eyes, they said, were wide with a terror that seemed to see past the walls of the cabin and into another realm. He thrashed and choked, spewing a foul black bile that stained the floorboards. Alara worked frantically, forcing bitter tinctures between his clenched teeth and applying poultices that steamed with a pungent, earthy smell. But her remedies were useless. By nightfall, Silas Hemlock was dead. His body was unnaturally stiff, his hands clenched so tightly his fingernails had drawn blood from his palms. Preacher Thuron was summoned. He took one look at the corpse, at the black vomit staining the bedsheets, at the strange herbs laid out on the table, and made his proclamation. This was no natural sickness. This was a death born of sin and witchcraft. He pointed a trembling finger at the grieving Alara and declared that her husband had paid the price for her unholy communion with dark forces. The word curse was spoken aloud for the first time, a whisper that would soon become a roar. The community, already primed for suspicion, now had its witch. In the days following Silas's disturbing death, a pall of fear descended upon Blackwood Creek. The air grew thick with suspicion, and the whispers that had once followed Alara Hemlock now became open accusations. She was shunned at the communal well, her presence causing women to gather their children and retreat indoors. She was now, officially, the Widow Hemlock, a title that in Blackwood Creek was less a statement of marital status and more a mark of damnation. The fear was a living entity, feeding on the ignorance of the townsfolk and growing stronger with every sermon from Preacher Thuron. He spoke of the serpent in the garden, the temptress who leads men to their doom. He didn't need to say Alara's name. Every soul in his congregation knew who he meant. The curse, they believed, had not died with Silas. It was merely dormant, coiled and waiting in the widow's cabin. And then it struck again. The victim was an 8-year-old boy, Thomas Kane, son of the settlement's most respected patriarch. He awoke one morning with a raging fever, the same wild, terrified look in his eyes that had been in Silas Hemlock's. He complained of his stomach twisting into knots and began to vomit the same horrifying black substance. The community was paralyzed with a dread so profound it was almost a religious experience. This was it. The widow's curse had been unleashed upon them. As little Thomas Kane's condition worsened, his mother, Martha, grew desperate. Ignoring the fearful warnings of her neighbors and the stern commands of her husband, she ran to one person in the valley who might possess the knowledge to fight this unnatural illness. She ran to the widow's cabin. She found Alara grinding herbs with a stone pestle, her face etched with a grim, focused intensity. Martha begged her to help, to use her strange knowledge to save her son. Alara hesitated, her dark eyes scanning Martha's face, weighing the risk. She knew how this would be perceived, how her intervention, whether it succeeded or failed, would be twisted and used against her. But looking at the desperate mother, she relented. She prepared a poultice of mashed root in a dark, bitter tea, giving Martha strict instructions on how to administer them. She warned that the boy's fever would spike, that he might see terrible things, but that they had to purge the poison from his body. Martha rushed back to her son's bedside and applied the forbidden remedies. For a few hours it seemed to work. The boy's convulsions lessened, but then, just as Alara had warned, the fever returned with a vengeance. Thomas began to scream, pointing at the corners of the room, crying out about shadowy figures with burning eyes. By dawn, he was dead. The news ripped roughed the settlement like a plague wind. Alara Hemlock had not tried to save the boy, she had sealed his fate. She was a murderer, a witch. The curse was real. Thomas Kane's death broke the dam of restraint to righteous, terrifying fury. The curse was no longer a suspicion. It was an undeniable fact, confirmed by the death of an innocent child. Jebediah Kane, the boy's father, stood before Preacher Thuron's church, his face a mask of grief and rage, and publicly accused the widow Hemlock of witchcraft and murder. The preacher, seizing the moment, delivered a sermon that set the valley ablaze. He spoke of a holy war, a battle for the very souls of Blackwood Creek. He declared that God demanded they purge the evil from their midst to cut out the cancer before it could spread. That very evening, the sickness claimed another victim, an elderly woman named Edith Miller. She died in the same agonizing, convulsive manner, her last words a string of terrified nonsense about the ground opening up beneath her. Panic erupted. This was not a targeted attack. It was an indiscriminate plague sent from the pits of hell, and the widow was its gatekeeper. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, viewing their neighbors with suspicion. Who had spoken to the widow? Who had accepted a gift of wild berries from her? Who was next? The delicate threads of community that held Blackwood Creek together were snapping, one by one, replaced by the isolating chains of terror. The widow's curse was now a living thing, and it was hungry. The sickness spread with the horrifying efficiency of a forest fire. Within a week, a dozen more people were afflicted. The symptoms were always the same: a sudden, violent onset of fever and stomach cramps, followed by the terrifying black vomit. But it was the delirium that was the most disturbing part. The victims seemed to be trapped in a shared nightmare. They clawed at their own skin, shouting about spiders crawling in their veins and whispering voices in the walls. They saw demons in the faces of their loved ones and died screaming at horrors only they could see. The one-sorterly settlement descended into a state of anarchic terror. The healthy refused to tend to the sick, leaving them to die alone in their cabins. The sound of weeping was constant, a mournful chorus punctuated by the sudden, sharp shrieks of the dying. Preacher Thuron saw this not as a tragedy, but as a divine trial. He roamed the settlement, his Bible held aloft like a weapon, preaching that this was God's wrath. He claimed the sickness was a spiritual contagion, and only the pure of heart would be spared. He forbade anyone from leaving the valley, declaring that to flee was to carry the devil's plague into the world of men. He had, in effect, quarantined his flock, trapping the healthy with the dying, the sane with the mad. And all the while, their hatred for the woman they blamed for their suffering festered, growing more toxic than the curse itself. If you find these accounts of buried history as compelling as we do, consider subscribing to our channel. We are dedicated to unearthing the forbidden stories that have been deliberately erased, because the truth of what happened in Blackwood Creek is far more macabre than a simple folk tale of a witch's curse. The reality is a cold case, a disturbing puzzle of mass death that was intentionally covered up. What follows is not for the faint of heart. While the community turned on itself, consumed by religious hysteria, the one person they accused of witchcraft was desperately trying to find a cure. Alara Hemlock had not been seen since the death of Thomas Kane. She had seemingly vanished into the dense forest that surrounded the valley. The townsfolk were convinced she was communing with her dark masters, drawing power from their suffering to fuel her curse. They nailed crude hex signs to their doors and left offerings of salt on their windowsills, reverting to ancient superstitions in a desperate attempt to ward off the evil they believed she commanded. They imagined her lurking in the shadows, a malevolent phantom watching them die, a cruel smile on her face. The truth, however, was far different. Ilara was not hiding. She was hunting. She was desperately searching for the source of the sickness, working against time as the death toll mounted. She knew this was no supernatural curse. It was poison, a poison of the earth. The paranoia in Blackwood Creek reached a fever pitch. Neighbors who had known each other for generations now peered at one another through cracks in their doors, their eyes filled with accusation. A shared meal was now a potential death sentence. A drink of water from the communal well was a terrifying gamble. The social fabric of the settlement had completely disintegrated, leaving only raw, animalistic fear. Jebediah Kane, maddened by grief, became the preacher's enforcer. He led a small group of men on nightly patrols, their torches cutting feeble paths through the oppressive darkness. They were looking for any sign of the widow, any proof of her witchcraft. They searched the woods around her abandoned cabin, finding strange bundles of twigs tied with black thread and symbols scratched into the bark of trees. Markers Ilara had left to track the spread of a strange, creeping fungus she suspected was the source of the poison. But to the ignorant and terrified men of Blackwood Creek, these were not scientific observations. They were satanic sigils, irrefutable proof of a covenant with the devil. Each discovery further cemented their conviction that they were locked in a battle with a powerful and malevolent witch. They were no longer just looking to cast her out. They were looking to destroy her. The hunt for the widow Hemlock had begun in earnest. News of a plague in the remote mountains traveled slowly, carried by the rare hunter or prospector who passed near the valley's edge. Eventually, a garbled report of a mountain fever that had claimed half a settlement reached the county seat. The duty of investigating fell to Deputy Marshal Elias Thorne, a man who believed more in the evil of men than in the fables of the devil. Thorne was a pragmatist, a former Union soldier who had seen the worst of humanity and had little patience for superstition. He rode into Blackwood Creek in late September, nearly a month after the sickness had begun. The scene that greeted him was one out of a nightmare. The valley was eerily quiet, the air thick with the smell of sickness and decay. He saw faces peering from behind boarded-up windows, eyes wide with fear and hostility. His presence was not welcome. He was an outsider, another unknown in a world that had shrunk to the size of a single, terrifying idea: the curse. He found Preacher Thuron holding a grim sermon over a row of freshly dug graves, his voice ringing with damnation. When Thorne tried to question him, the preacher spoke not of disease, but of a righteous purge, a divine cleansing of their sinful land. He warned the marshal that the laws of man had no jurisdiction here. Only God's law remained, and God's law demanded a blood sacrifice. Marshal Thorne was a meticulous record keeper. In a small, leather-bound journal, he began to document the horrifying reality of Blackwood Creek. His entries, written in a steady, precise hand that grew increasingly frantic over time, provide the only objective account of the valley's descent into madness. He dismissed the talk of curses as the ravings of a terrified and isolated populace. He was certain he was dealing with a virulent contagion, perhaps a strain of cholera or typhoid, accelerated by the unsanitary conditions and the community's refusal to seek outside help. He began his investigation, visiting the cabins of the afflicted, his stomach churning at the grotesque scenes he witnessed. He noted the precise and terrifying consistency of the symptoms: the fever, the delirium, the black vomit. But he also noted details the townsfolk had missed in their panic. He observed that the victims' fingernails and lips had a faint bluish tint, a sign of something other than a simple fever. He also documented the shared nature of their hallucinations. They all spoke of the ground shaking, of a bitter metallic taste in their mouths, and of a shadowy figure with no face. These were not random delusions. This was a pattern that pointed not to witchcraft but to a single, horrifying source. Thorne, the man of logic, was beginning to feel a cold dread that had nothing to do with superstition. As Thorne delved deeper, he began to notice a geographical pattern to the sickness. The first to die, Silas Hemlock, the Kane boy, Edith Miller, had all lived in homes clustered around the main settlement well. Those who lived on the outlying homesteads, who drew their water from separate springs or creeks, had remained untouched by the affliction, at least initially. He approached the well, a stone-lined pit in the center of the village square. It was the heart of the community, the place where everyone gathered. Now it was a place of dread. He drew a bucket of water. It looked clear and had no unusual smell. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the answer lay somewhere in its dark, cold depths. He questioned Jebediah Kane, trying to piece together a timeline. Kane, his eyes burning with fanaticism, could only speak of the widow. He told the marshal about the day Silas had died. The day before, Silas had performed his annual duty of cleaning the well, climbing down to scrub the stones and clear out the accumulated silt. He had emerged covered in mud and complaining of a bitter taste he couldn't wash from his mouth. The next day he was dead. To Kane and the others this was irrelevant. All that mattered was that Silas was the widow's husband. But for Marshal Thorne, a crucial piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. The curse didn't come from the widow's cabin. It came from the ground beneath their feet. Thorne's investigation was met with resistance at every turn. The remaining townsfolk, now numbering less than 20, were completely under the sway of Preacher Thuron. They saw Thorne not as a lawman, but as a blasphemer, a man who tried to explain God's wrath with earthly logic. They refused to answer his questions about the well, about the victim's symptoms, about anything other than the demonic power of the widow Hemlock. They were a flock united in their delusion, and their shepherd was leading them directly to the slaughter. Thorne found his only source of information in the fearful whispers of an old woman, one of the few who seemed to retain a sliver of sanity. She told him of older legends, stories that her grandmother had told her, tales of the land itself being sour, cursed by the spirits of the native people who were driven from it generations ago. She spoke of a hunger in the soil, a malevolence that would sometimes seep into the water and drive men mad before killing them. She claimed that this had happened before, long ago, and that the only reason it stopped was because of the knowledge of the old ones, people who knew the ways of the earth and how to appease it. People, she whispered, just like the widow. She was describing a history of endemic poisoning, passed down as folklore. Armed with this new information, the folklore of the sour earth and the timeline pointing to the well cleaning, Thorne began to formulate a terrifying hypothesis. This was not a bacterial contagion. It was a geological one. He believed a vein of toxic mineral, perhaps arsenic or lead, ran deep beneath the valley. Silas Hemlock, in cleaning the well, must have disturbed this vein, releasing a lethal concentration of poison into the community's only water source. The black vomit, the blue lips, the neurological chaos, it all fit the profile of heavy metal poisoning. The shared hallucinations were a symptom of the toxin attacking the brain. The widow's curse was a tragic, horrifying misunderstanding. Alara Hemlock, with her deep knowledge of botany and the earth, was likely the only person who could have recognized the signs. Her spells were not acts of witchcraft, but desperate attempts to create an antidote from purifying herbs. But how could he convince a people maddened by fear and religious fervor? To them, the devil was real and tangible, and he lived in the form of a woman. A scientific explanation was a far more terrifying concept, for it meant that their suffering was random, meaningless, and a direct result of their own ignorance. It was a truth they were not prepared to accept. While Thorne was racing to uncover the scientific truth, the mob was closing in on their supernatural one. The hunt for Alara Hemlock had become the sole focus of the remaining survivors. They saw her capture as their only path to salvation. Led by Jebediah Kane and sanctified by Preacher Thuron, a party of 5 men, their faces grim and their hearts filled with righteous hatred, set out to scour the mountains. They were convinced she was hiding in one of the many caves that dotted the limestone cliffs overlooking the valley. They moved with a grim purpose, their torches casting long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar woods into a landscape of monsters. They were no longer men. They were crusaders in a holy war, and their fear had burned away their humanity, leaving only a cold, hard kernel of vengeance. They believed they were hunting a demon, a creature of immense power. The irony was that they were hunting a terrified and desperate woman who was, at that very moment, risking her life to save them. This disparity between their perception and the horrifying reality is what makes this story so deeply macabre. They were not fighting a curse. They were the curse. And if you want to support our deep dives into these forbidden cold cases of history, take a moment to hit the like button. It helps us bring more of these forgotten tragedies into the light. The mob found her cabin first. It was empty, a cold hearth and the lingering smell of dried herbs hanging in the air. On the rough-hewn wooden table lay her tattered book, left open in her haste. The men crowded around it, their torchlight illuminating the strange diagrams and elegant foreign script. To them, it was a book of shadows, a grimoire filled with incantations and demonic pacts. Jebediah Cain, his hands trembling with rage, saw a detailed drawing of a human heart surrounded by thorny vines and declared it a hex upon the people of Blackwood Creek. In reality, it was a botanical illustration of a nightshade plant, with notes on its cardiotoxic properties. They saw what they wanted to see, what their fear demanded they see. In a small, locked chest, they found dozens of small, cloth bundles filled with more strange roots and powders. These were her reagents, the components of her attempted antidotes to tea. He mobbed they were curse bags, instruments of black magic. This was all the proof they needed. With a roar of fury, Cain kicked the table over, sending the book and the herbs scattering across the floor. They set the cabin ablaze, the flames leaping into the night sky, a beacon of their righteous hatred. They had destroyed her lair. Now all that was left was to destroy the witch herself. The burning cabin served its purpose. It drew Alara out of hiding. From a high ridge, she saw the orange glow and knew her time was running out. She had spent the last 2 weeks in the high mountains, subsisting on roots and berries, desperately searching for the source of the contamination. She had found it, a spring, miles upstream from the settlement, that trickled out of a rock face streaked with a sickly yellow and black mineral deposit. The water that fed this spring was a slow, lethal poison. She had also found what she believed was a counteragent, a rare, deep-growing root that local fauna instinctively avoided. She had gathered as much as she could, knowing it was her only chance to convince the people of the truth and save the few who remained. Seeing the fire, she knew she could wait no longer. She had to go back down. She had to face them, to try and make them understand. It was a suicidal act, a descent into a pit of vipers, but the thought of the remaining children dying from the poisoned water drove her onward. She ran down the mountainside, the smoke and ash of her burning home guiding her toward her doom, clutching a bundle of the life-saving roots in her hand. A remedy that the people of Blackwood Creek would tragically mistake for a weapon. The mob, energized by their act of destruction, spotted her moving through the trees, a lone figure silhouetted against the flickering light of her burning home. They gave chase, their shouts echoing through the dead valley. Alara ran, not toward the settlement, but in the opposite direction, toward the old, abandoned quarry at the valley's edge. She wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to lead them somewhere, to show them something. The men, blinded by their fury, saw it only as a chase. They cornered her at the edge of a deep, water-filled pit. She stood there, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes wild but clear, holding up the gnarled root she carried. She began to shout at them, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and desperation. She tried to explain about the water, about the poison seeping from the rocks, about the spring that fed the well. She pleaded with them to listen, to let her help them. But her words were drowned out by the thunder of their hatred. Jebediah Cain stepped forward, his face a twisted mask of grief. "Witch," he spat, "your lies are finished. You will not claim another soul from this valley." They closed in, a circle of righteous vengeance, trapping her between their rage and the dark, still water of the quarry pit. There was no escape. It was Preacher Thuron who delivered the final judgment. He emerged from the trees, his Bible held before him like a shield. He did not seem to see a desperate, terrified woman. He saw the embodiment of all the evil and suffering that had befallen his flock. His voice, practiced and powerful from years in the pulpit, boomed across the quarry. He condemned her in the name of God, listing her sins, her consorting with spirits, her poisoning of the land, her murder of the innocent. He declared her a vessel of Satan, an unholy blight that had to be scoured from the earth. Alara stared at him, a look of horrified realization dawning on her face. She saw that it was useless. Their minds were sealed shut, locked by a fear so profound that no truth could penetrate it. They did not want a cure. They wanted a sacrifice. They wanted a simple, monstrous answer to their complex, horrifying problem. As the men grabbed her arms, she spoke her last words. She did not beg for her life. Instead, she looked past the mob, her eyes fixing on something far away, and uttered a chilling prophecy. "You fools," she whispered, her voice carrying an unnatural weight. "Killing me will not end the curse. You carry it inside you. It is in your water. It is in your blood. And now it will claim you all." The end was brutal and swift. They did not grant her the mercy of a quick death. In their minds, a witch had to suffer. They bound her hands and feet. Preacher Thuron recited a frantic, garbled prayer of exorcism as Jebediah Cain tied a large rock to her ankles. They dragged her to the edge of the quarry pit. For a moment, she hung there, suspended between the hateful faces of the accusers and the black, reflective water below. Then they let her go. She hit the water with a quiet splash that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. There were a few moments of frantic bubbling, and then nothing. The surface of the quarry settled back into a placid, dark mirror, reflecting the torchlight and the grim, triumphant faces of the men who had just murdered their only hope. They stood there for a long time, watching as if expecting her to rise again, but she was gone. A profound and uneasy quiet fell over the group. They had done it. They had vanquished the evil. They had killed the witch. They turned and walked back toward their dying settlement, convinced that they had broken the widow's curse. They were wrong. They had just sealed their own fates, and the curse was only just beginning its final, horrifying act. The execution of Alara Hemlock did not bring salvation. It brought an acceleration of the horror. The mob returned to the settlement, their righteous fury already beginning to curdle into a new kind of dread. The curse was supposed to have lifted with her death. The air was supposed to feel lighter. The sick were supposed to start recovering. But nothing changed. In fact, it got worse. That very night, 2 more people died, their screams echoing through the desolate valley. The poison in the well water, untempered by Alara's desperate attempts at an antidote, was reaching its peak concentration. The few remaining survivors, their hope of a supernatural solution shattered, were now left with a terrifying void. If killing the witch hadn't worked, what would? What if the curse wasn't tied to her at all? The seed of a doubt far more terrifying than any witch began to sprout in their minds. The sickness was not an act of will, not something that could be fought or appeased. It was an implacable, unstoppable force of nature, a force they had invited into their bodies with every cup of water they drank. The true, scientific horror of their situation was slowly dawning, far too late. The first of the executioners to fall was Jebediah Cain. He awoke the next morning with the telltale fire in his gut. By midday, he was in the throes of a violent delirium, thrashing in his bed and screaming the name of his dead son. He clawed at the walls, his eyes wide with the same specific terror that he had seen in so many others. He died seeing the same demons, the same whispering shadows. His death sent a shockwave of absolute terror through the last handful of survivors. He had been the curse's most ardent foe, the leader of the mob, the man who had personally sent the witch to her death. He was supposed to have been immune, protected by his righteousness. His death proved that no one was safe. It proved that Alara's final prophecy was coming true. The curse was in their blood. One by one, the other members of the lynch mob succumbed, each dying in the same horrifying manner, trapped in the same shared nightmare. Their last moments were not filled with righteous triumph, but with the agonizing, hellish symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, the very affliction they had murdered a woman for trying to cure. The final act of the tragedy centered on preacher Thuron Cole. After the execution, he had retreated to his church, locking the doors and praying for a sign that their sacrifice had been accepted. But the only answer to his prayers was the sound of more screaming, more death. Then the sickness came for him. It began subtly, with a tremor in his hands and a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth that no amount of prayer could wash away. He tried to deny it, to cast it out with scripture and fasting. But the poison was indifferent to his faith. The fever came, and with it, the hallucinations. But his visions were uniquely tailored to his own tormented soul. He did not see abstract demons or shadows. He saw Alara Hemlock, rising from the quarry, her eyes burning with cold fire, her voice whispering every verse of damnation he had ever preached back at him. He saw the faces of every man, woman, and child who had died, their mouths open in silent accusation. His church, his sanctuary, became his personal hell. His rigid faith, the bedrock of his entire existence, crumbled, leaving him alone with the terrifying truth. His God had abandoned him, or worse, had never been listening at all. Marshall Thorne, sequestered in a small, abandoned cabin on the edge of the settlement, was also dying. He had been subsisting on his own rations, but had made the fatal mistake of drinking from the well just once upon his arrival. He knew his time was short. With a trembling hand, he laid out the pages of his journal, his mind racing to assemble the final pieces of the puzzle before the delirium claimed him completely. He reviewed his notes, the timeline of the death starting after the well cleaning, the specific neurological symptoms, the folklore of the sour earth, Alara's final, desperate screams about the water. It was all there. A clear, logical, and utterly horrifying chain of events. A case of mass poisoning, misattributed to the supernatural because of the ignorance and fear of an isolated community. He wrote furiously, his handwriting becoming a barely legible scrawl. He documented his theory, hoping that this journal would one day be found, that the truth of what happened in Blackwood Creek would not be buried with its victims. He wanted the world to know that the monster in this story was not a witch. It was a combination of geology, fear, and the terrifying power of mass hysteria, a force far more destructive than any curse. The ultimate irony of the Blackwood Creek tragedy is macabre and profound. Preacher Thuron, in his final, lucid moments, stumbled from his church and made his way to the well. Perhaps he intended to throw himself in to join the source of his damnation. Or perhaps, in a final, desperate act of madness, he believed he could bless the water and undo the evil. He knelt at the edge, his body racked with convulsions, and began to preach to the dark water below. It was his final sermon. He confessed his pride, his fear, his sin of leading his flock to their doom. He begged for a forgiveness that would never come. And then he pitched forward and fell silent, his body slumping against the cold stones of the well that he had turned into a communal grave. He was the last one, the 37th soul claimed by the curse. He died at the epicenter of the tragedy, killed not by a witch's hex, but by his own unshakable, fatal conviction. He had been so determined to find a devil to fight that he failed to see the real poison until he was drowning in it. In his final journal entry, Marshall Thorne described the end. He wrote not with the detached tone of a lawman, but with the raw terror of a man facing his own mortality. The poison had taken hold, and the lines between reality and hallucination were blurring. "The tremors have started," he wrote, his penmanship jagged and chaotic. "A bitter taste, like old pennies. The shadows in the corners of my eyes are taking shape. They move when I'm not looking. I understand now what the victims saw. It is not a demon. It is the brain shutting down, creating its own horrors, a chemical storm, and yet it feels real, so terribly real." He described seeing a tall, faceless figure standing at the foot of his bed, a recurring hallucination among the victims. He knew it was a product of the poison, but in his final, terrified moments he couldn't be sure. "The widow's curse was real," he scrawled as his final line. "Not hers, ours. We were the curse." His pen trailed off the page, the journal falling from his lifeless hand. He became the 38th victim, an outsider swallowed by a tragedy he had tried and failed to stop. His testimony, the key to this entire disturbing cold case, was lost to the dust. For 30 years, Blackwood Creek was a ghost town, a silent, macabre museum of death, preserved by its own isolation. The story of what happened there was deliberately suppressed, County officials, fearing a mass panic about water contamination in the wider region, sealed the records. The official cause of death for the entire settlement was listed as a single, vague entry: outbreak of mountain fever. The valley was declared unsafe for settlement and quietly erased from local maps. It became a forbidden place, a blank spot in the geography of Appalachia. The few locals who lived on the surrounding ridges knew better. They passed down the story not as a case of poisoning, but as a cautionary tale. They spoke of a valley haunted by a powerful witch, a place so evil the ground itself had soured. They warned their children never to venture into the hollow where the silence reigns, lest they fall prey to the lingering power of the widow's curse. The legend became a tool, a way to keep people away, to ensure the horrifying secret of Blackwood Creek remained buried. The folklore, born of ignorance, ironically became the tragedy's final guardian. The discovery of the settlement by the trapper, Alastair Finch, in 1924, briefly brought the story back into the light. He reported his horrifying find to the authorities, who reluctantly sent a team to investigate. They found the mummified remains, just as he had described. They also found Marshall Thorne's journal in the cabin where he died. The journal laid out the entire logical sequence of events, a perfect explanation for the mass death. It was a solved case, a clear-cut tragedy of environmental poisoning compounded by human error. But the world of 1924 was not ready for such a complex and godless explanation. The official report acknowledged the journal but ultimately dismissed its conclusions. It was easier and far more palatable to stick with the original story. The deaths were officially attributed to a uniquely virulent, unidentified pathogen. The journal was filed away and forgotten, deemed the rambling work of a fever-addled mind. The truth was reburied, this time under a mountain of bureaucracy. The story of the widow's curse, with its simple morality of good versus evil, was a far more comfortable narrative than the disturbing reality of a community that poisoned itself through sheer, terrified ignorance. And so, the cold case of the 37 souls of Blackwood Creek remains officially unsolved, at least in the popular imagination. The legend endures, more powerful than the truth. It has become a classic piece of Appalachian Gothic, a chilling tale told around campfires. In the story, Alara Hemlock is not a tragic victim. She is a demonic villain, a powerful witch who laid a curse upon the land that remains to this day. They say that on still nights, you can hear the faint sound of her weeping on the wind, forever bound to the quarry where she met her end. They say the water in the valley still runs black with her poison, and that no living thing will ever grow there again. The narrative of the curse is so powerful because it provides a villain, a target for the fear. The truth, that the villain was the fear itself, is a far more disturbing concept. It suggests that the capacity for such horror lies not in some external, supernatural evil, but within the delicate, flawed machinery of the human mind, waiting for the right combination of isolation, ignorance, and terror to be unleashed. What is the true legacy of Blackwood Creek? Is it a story about the dangers of a contaminated water source, or is it a parable about the terrifying power of belief? Marshall Thorne provided a rational explanation, a neat and tidy solution to the mystery, but his own final, terrified words betray a doubt. "It feels real," he wrote of the hallucinations. The 37 souls who died did not believe they were being poisoned. They believed they were being haunted. They died in the grip of a supernatural terror so profound and so absolute that it became their reality. This raises a disturbing, and perhaps unanswerable, question. Can a collective belief, a shared hysteria of such immense power, actually manifest something? Did the people of Blackwood Creek, in their certainty of being cursed, somehow give that curse a life of its own, turning a chemical poison into a truly malevolent spiritual entity? Or was it simply a case of the human mind creating its own demons before the end? We are left to wonder if the horror was purely physical, or if it crossed a forbidden line into the realm of the metaphysical. The physical location of Blackwood Creek is lost to time. The forest has reclaimed it, the cabins have collapsed, and the gravestones have been swallowed by the earth. All that remains is the story, a creepy tale passed down through generations that serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly the veneer of civilization can be stripped away, leaving only primal fear. The story of the widow's curse is a forbidden history, a disturbing cold case that leaves us with more questions than answers. It forces us to look into the dark corners of our own nature and wonder what we might be capable of if we were isolated, terrified, and utterly convinced that a monster lived among us. The 37 souls of Blackwood Creek were not just victims of a poison in the water. They were victims of a poison in the mind. And that is a toxin for which there has never been, and will never be, a cure. The silence in that forgotten valley is a testament to this horrifying truth, a silence that lingers, waiting for the next person to stumble upon its story and feel the cold touch of the widow's curse.